Welcome to your review for the final. Basically, I'm going to take you through chapters 5 through 10 of your textbook, Koska 7th edition, and show you the things that will be highlighted from these chapters in the final. That allows you to go to these pages in your book, read and review, and look at some of the self-test questions. All the self-test questions have answers in the back. So in chapter 5, when it's talking about principles of voice leading, this is getting us set up so that we can do like 4-part and 3-part writing and compose simple melodies to go on top. We on the final are not going to do too much with the let's write melodies and get them with a single high spot and such like that. But do want to mention tendency tones will be something that comes up. And remember that for our purposes, a tendency tone is T, or 7th degree of the scale, and 7th of a chord if you have a chord with a 7th on it, and then 5th of diminished triads are tendency tones. We don't like to double them. Not too much about these first chapters or pages here, but I think probably what we want to get out of this is we want to get spacing and stem direction. So you'll want to look on page 70 here, and it talks about getting stem directions in the wrong ways, right? Or crossing voices, getting your spacing correct. And then finally in this chapter, cross voices are over here. You can read about that, but we're in page 70-ish. And then after that, there's some basic ranges. It'd be good to reflect on that, make sure that you've got that okay, spacing right there. And then parallel motion are the rules about objectionable parallels. And so we talk about unacceptable parallel fifths and octaves. They're defined here for you and given definitions on the next page right here. We have what they call consecutive or contrary motion fifths and octaves, okay? And it's the same rule. You can't have any pair of voices in a fifth going to another fifth in the same direction or opposite direction. Same thing for a perfect octave when they move and they change chords. And hidden or direct octaves or fifths. This is always one that we go over. It's really easy to check for, and yet it's seems a little quirky because it has 3 steps to it. So if your soprano and your bass arrive in an octave or a fifth, they moved in similar motion. In other words, they both went up or down, but not parallel motion, because it would be parallel fifths or octaves. And the soprano skipped when they changed chords. So soprano skipped, arrived with the bass in a fifth or an octave, and the bass moved in the same direction as the soprano. That's a hidden or direct fifth, and we don't like that. Okay. And you can go through some of these chapter quizzes and see if you understand some of these concepts. I would expect that you're going to get a question very similar to the one on the bottom of page 79, right there. And that's chapter 5. Okay, writing in root position. This is from chapter 6, and it's the beginning of the term. And we had a whole bunch of formulas. We had chords that were a 4th and 5th apart, chords that were a 2nd apart or 7th, chords that were a 3rd apart, and obviously they're inversions, and they all had formulas. And so you should expect one of every one of these on the final, so that you have to do them correctly. Okay. Remember, these all are in root positioned with double root. Okay. And you can go through all of these. We also did much work on them, and it would be helpful if you went and did a couple of these kind of things. You like the exercise in the book to make sure that you can do that. Sometimes the mistakes you make here, though, are caused by not setting up the chord correctly. Just one thing about 3-part textures. In general, we're not going to do 3-part textures for the final, just because of space and time. Remember that we always want to have root in the 3rd. Complete chords are better when we get away from the formulas. Okay. All right. Don't forget, I think I want to highlight that when you're doing chords that are a step apart, right, it's always move opposite the bass step right there. but for the deceptive progression of 5 to 6, T likes to go to do, must go to do if we're in the minor mode or if it's in soprano. All right. And don't worry about ranges and transpositions. So we're not going to test that on the final. It's important that you get ideas on how to voice chords, but we've done some of that. It's just not going to happen on the final, but we'll come back to it again and again because it's practical music. All right. Harmonic progression and the sequence. Well, we spent some time recently on this. You can read through here, but I think what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to calculate circles of fifths. Okay, this is the first and biggest chord progression that we have going down by fifths. And sequences are little ideas, motives that are repeated again and again at different step levels. Okay, often connected heavily to circle of fifths. They have a thing here that we've never talked about. I'll just bring it up real quick. Tonal sequence is when you have an idea or a pattern that follows the same contour, but because of the half steps in the scale, like here you have a half step, but here you don't in the same location, that's called a tonal sequence because it follows the tonality of the key. A real sequence is when you actually put in the accidentals to make the interval distance, not just the contour, exactly the same, and that's called the real sequence. Not going to be on your test, but there you go. Okay. We are interested in being able to calculate circle of fifths all the time in any key. And then this is expanded, exploded view of, you know, going 1 and 5 chords, and then the 2 chord goes to the 5 chord and so on, all the way down to getting a full diagram, right? After it goes through all of these that we talked about, you should be able to memorize and get information from here of 1 going to 4 and 1 going to 5 and then going back. It's the mini game. But eventually dominant chords go to tonic chords. Tonic chords can go to anything. These predominants 4 and 2 like to go there. 6 can go there, although we've seen instances where 6 goes directly to 5, even though they say it can't. But then 6 can go to 4 or 2, 4 can go to 2. These guys don't go backwards. And then they progress to the 5 chord. And then there. 3 is out in the outlier. When you get a 3, it can go down to 6 by a third or up to 4 by a step, because down by fifth is strong, up by step is pretty strong, down by thirds is considered soft or not so strong, but still acceptable. And then differences in minor is that the major 3 chord is the relative major, so it gets a lot of love, whereas in the major key, it's pretty specialized. So we see this a lot, and we precede it with a subtonic 7. This is just circle of fifths, but if this is your relative major to the minor key, this is the 5 chord for it. And otherwise, it's really similar, just your chord values are different. I would make sure that I knew this really well, that I could draw it out. And then I would go and check out my 7-1 test again, because it has questions and answers for you. This is on page 109 right there. Okay. All right. Yeah. And then going on, triads in first inversion. This is getting away from writing with formulas. It's saying that your bass line can invert chords, and they basically do the same thing as root position chords. They function the same. They can interchange for them. They give you a melodic bass line. They allow you to get out of parallel octaves and parallel fifths and things like that. Sometimes when the soprano is not obeying what we would call formulas for their melodies, okay? And you can go through all of this, and it talks about why we like to put diminished triads in first inversion. We've talked about this a bit. I don't think we're gonna do too much about that, but remember that we don't double the fifth of diminished chords, right? All right, this is where you'll start to do free writing, try and get smooth lines, try and get a root and a third in the chord, try desperately not to get parallel fifths, parallel octaves, consecutive fifth R, and fifths by contrary motion, unequal fifths, and of course hidden and direct fifths and octaves. Okay, so this is where we do that. So you have to start checking all the time. Don't worry about parallel 6 chords and things like that. And then, you know, I would do some of the part writing at the end of this chapter right here, where it says, hey, why don't you, check me out and do some of that? It would be good to do. Again, we're going to focus on 4-part writing. All right, Triads in second inversion. Remember that there are only 4 times where you can have a triad in second inversion, right? You can do it when you have, and anytime we find a triad in second inversion, we have to bracket it and label it. We only double the 5th unless we absolutely cannot not double the 5th, right? But the 5th gets doubled, in other words, the root note, okay? And the 4 kinds of triads that are in second inversion are the melodic or arpeggiating bass line, right? It's part of a pattern, okay? The cadential 6/4, and remember with this one, we put the underneath bracket and say the 1/6/4 going to a 5 is all 5 chords right there all the time. I'm on page 135. I'm in chapter 9, I think. 9, yes. And then there is the passing chord right there, right? Which fills in a gap like a passing tone in the bass line. And then there's the pedal chord where the bottom holds out and the chord changes and changes into the chord and out of the chord again. We double the 5th. And finally, well, no, that's it, pedal. So we have arpeggiating melodic bass, cadential tonic 6/4, passing chord, and pedal chord. Okay, you'll probably have to part rate with these. You'll probably have to find them and bracket them when they're in a piece of music. Again, these exercises at the self-test would be really good to go over. Finally, cadences, phrases, and periods. It's where we started the term. You should be able to define each cadence, which would be a perfect authentic cadence, an imperfect authentic cadence, a half cadence, a plagal cadence, and a deceptive cadence. You should know what a I was going to say, what's the name of it? Plagal, not plagal, sorry. The cadence that comes from the Baroque period, and I wanted to call it Phryxian, which because it's kind of like that, but because that's a Magic the Gathering card thing, I'm embarrassed to say. They sound really similar. Phrygian, there we go, Phrygian, thank you, sorry. Phrygian half cadence, which is a special kind of half cadence, and you'll find that right there. But remember, cadences, although we defined them, okay, then allowed us to see what a phrase was, right? And then when you combine phrases together, you get sentences and period structures and double periods and things like that. And so that's the balance of the chapter right there, where it talks about period forms, right? And then whether they're parallel, contrary, or contrasting, whether they're symmetrical or asymmetrical, whether they have the antecedent has 2 or 1 phrases in it, and the consequent or answer has 2 or 1 phrases. There's the double period right there. So chapter 10. That's it. Like that wasn't enough. There's the sentence for you right there. Okay. I'd expect that you'll have to be able to identify and define every kind of cadence and every kind of basic structure in terms of phrases and things like that. Okay. If you get into the middle of these chapters and you go, I still don't understand something, well, make sure you read it carefully, go back through your worksheets and go back through the videos that we did from our classes, because we usually spend a good amount of time there. Also, at the end of every chapter, there's a beautiful summary, right? That has a lot of the information there, which would be maybe the place I'd start when I was reviewing them. And then when you go to the back of the book here, remember that just like a math book, there's answers. So chapter 6, all the answers to the test. So as you do a little work, you can check and see how you're doing. What's my last piece of advice for you? I wouldn't try and study 5 or 6 chapters all in 1.5 days. I would go through the topics and take a look at the kinds of questions and spot check and do little bits and pieces. Also, in addition to that, you're going to make sure that you can spell your scales and that you can read your notes, spell your triads and your chords, because if you can't do those things, these other things are fraught with peril, right? All right, there you go. Hopefully that's helpful. When I said, we went through the book here, this is because it's a resource you have. The explanations are good. The exercises are there and they're good. And they also have answer keys with them. So this is where I would go to, plus just looking at your old worksheets and other materials that I gave you, as well as going to the films of our Zoom classes, because we spent a lot of time talking about and working on certain things there. Good luck.